I'm not going to say anything as blanket as the United States doesn't need to worry about terrorism anymore. But the mechanics of the future are going to add an extremely thick layer of insulation to America's already impressive distance from the world at large. Take a look at the map. It's the same global stability map I've shown you before, but this time with an overlay for Muslim population concentrations. There are a few takeaways from this map. Not very many places in the Islamic world will have decentralized governments. Many of the locations that the West fears will become breeding grounds for terrorism, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, will become such security no man's lands that transnational groups simply will not be able to function. There will certainly be a few decentralized areas in sub-Saharan Africa, but not only are those Muslim populations in the continental interior, they are also thoroughly engrossed in local issues rather than hell-bent on launching operations in distant continents. I see two areas of concern. Pakistan looms large as the most critical area. As a consequence of the September 11, 2001 attacks, U.S. forces began heavy operations. First to root out al-Qaeda and the Taliban from Afghanistan, and then to stabilize Afghanistan into some sort of form that could prevent al-Qaeda's and the Taliban's resurgence. Considering that Afghanistan is both rugged and landlocked, it should come as no surprise that both tasks were difficult, with the latter proving all but impossible. As part of the Afghan war effort, the Americans discovered that the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region is as rugged and porous as it is densely populated. Many militant groups, most notably the Afghan and Pakistani strains of the Taliban movement, call it home. That unsavory fact introduced the Americans good and hard to Pakistan's core statehood problem. Pakistan, in good times, is a state under siege, and it all comes down to geography. The Indus Valley is the Pakistani core, and the waters of the Indus are the merger of 5 smaller upland rivers that all originate in the Himalayas. However, unlike the similarly sourced Ganges, the middle reaches of the Indus system receive no rainfall. All of the rivers flood during the monsoons and must have their flows carefully managed to ensure regular water for the region's omnipresent irrigation works. If not for this management, the entire area, like the Nile Valley, would be desert. The Indus may have been navigable at some point deep in the past, but millennia of such tight management and such seasonal input extremes mean that in the contemporary period it is only navigable to Hyderabad, just a handful of miles from the Indian Ocean. From a capital generation and a social point of view, this puts Pakistan in a very similar basket as Egypt. A very thin crust of society manages the extremely capital-poor system, and everyone else is a de facto slave. That, however, and unfortunately, is where the similarity with Egypt ends. The middle region of the Indus system are not only not highland, but they directly abut the Ganges region. All that separates the heavily irrigated Indus basin from the perennially fertile Ganges basin is a low saddle of land just 100 miles deep. While this saddle is bracketed by a pair of impressive natural boundaries, the Himalayas and the Thar Desert, it is some 300 miles wide and leads directly into the most densely populated region of the world. It is broadly indefensible. Under any circumstances, the people of the Indus Valley will be heavily outnumbered by and exposed to the people of the far more populous Ganges Valley. And that's before including the other Indian territories. And that's before considering Pakistan's other borders. The entire western fringe of the Indus Basin is mountainous, but most of it actually gets more natural rainfall than the core Pakistani lands, which have to be irrigated with waters from the Indus and its tributaries. This allows permanent populations, if far smaller than the dense footprint of the Indus itself, to exist. The Sindhi and Punjabi peoples of the Indus lowlands are somewhat traditional riverine people who have struck a political deal to run the Pakistani state. The non-riverine peoples of the highlands, a mix of Pashtuns, Kashmiris, Baluchis, and many more, in contrast, live more traditionally and resent any effort by the lowlanders to assert control over them, often rebelling. The lowlanders would prefer to leave the highlanders be, but the highlanders sit upon a series of major passes, of which Khyber is the most infamous, that allow access from Central Asia and Persia into the Indus core. The Mongols used such routes. In more recent times, the Soviets threatened Pakistan via the same passes. As much as the Sindhi Punjabi core might not want to have to deal with the highlands, they dare not go without a military presence there. Put all these geographic features together and you get a very ugly country. To the east is a hostile India that would be more powerful than Pakistan under almost any scenario. To the northwest are a people who will always resist central power, but who must be subjugated in order to gain basic security for the core. Throughout the core Indus territories, there is a catastrophically high need for tight management and expensive irrigation to prevent desertification and starvation. Consequently, Pakistan is one of the poorest, most militarized, most corrupt, and least secure states ever created. The problems that the Americans discovered in their Afghan adventures are a direct consequence of the Pakistanis' successful efforts to turn a negative into a positive. With the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Pakistanis reasonably believed that they were next. They couldn't hope to stand up to the Soviets, much less the Indians combined with the Soviets, alone. And the peoples who lived in the highlands of northwest Pakistan had always been particularly unruly. The solution was to forge a new national identity based on Islam. Aggressive campaigning by the government sought to convince the mountain peoples of the border region that it was the Pakistanis' common religion that served as the glue to hold the Pakistani state together. The Soviets and Indians were portrayed as apostate foes. Instead of having to be in a state of low-grade war with their own citizens, the Pakistani Corps smiled as the mountain people started crossing the border to attack Soviet forces in Afghanistan, or shifted into Kashmir to attack Indian forces. Fast forward 30 years, and it is the Americans who are patrolling Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban, as some of the militias of the Pakistani mountain people are now known, attacked the Americans just as vociferously as they attacked the Soviets. They also see the Pakistani government's willingness to collaborate with the Americans in Afghanistan as a betrayal of the national identity at best or a sign of apostasy at worst. The suicide attacks that often mar Afghanistan and Kashmir now also occur within the Indus core with disturbing regularity. There have been many concerns that Islamists within the Pakistani government have often assisted the various Afghan and Pakistani militias by sharing intelligence about the disposition of American forces. This is certainly true. However, such assistance is not given on orders of Pakistan's civilian or military leadership, but instead by Islamists within the government ranks who wish to assist the Taliban for religious or strategic reasons. In essence, it is the Pakistani equivalent of Edward Snowden's leaks. The primary reason that Pakistan has proven able to survive the past decade is that the Americans needed it to. Afghanistan is landlocked, and Pakistan is the route in. So for a decade, the Americans bolstered Pakistan with military sales, cheap loans, and outright cash bribes that come out to roughly 8% of GDP, not to mention providing Pakistan with strategic cover versus India. Considering Pakistan's strategic vice, that could well be the difference between success and failure as a modern state. The relationship has always been an uncomfortable one for both sides, and it is about to dissolve. The Pakistanis fear that American actions in Afghanistan have stretched their relationship with the Pakistani Highlanders to the breaking point, and that when the Americans leave, the Lowland-Highland War will resume. American largesse is about to sharply end. And between the loss of resources and the newly infuriated nature of the Highlanders, the Pakistani lowlands' ability to manage its highlands will become sharply circumscribed. Not needing to battle for control of their own territories, the Highlanders will have the magic mix of partial security, identity, ability, and incentive to strike across national borders. Their primary target will be India, as these people have some serious bones to pick over Kashmir. They see the Indians as occupying a portion of their homeland. As Pakistan would prefer not to actually go to war with the superior India, Islamabad's efforts to rein in the Highlanders make it likely that the Highlanders will have on-again, off-again clashes with the Pakistani authorities in Islamabad as well. This is a problem, a big problem, but it is also a regionally contained problem. The Pakistani Taliban and groups like it are tied down by geography. Reaching the wider world would require first negotiating the Pakistani core, not to mention ignoring the local and compelling challenge of Kashmir. These groups certainly have the ability to strike across international borders, but there is really only one border they will care about. That's awful for India, but great for the Americans and the wider world.